So this is the time of year that dealers start to review and implement procedures moving forward for 2020. One of those being implementing 1.5 month supply in their parts inventory. Can you tell me a little bit about the unintended consequences that might come along with this, Sean?
So when they implement 1.5 month supply, that's actually industry guide across the board for parts inventory control. It is only one measurement, but typically it's a measurement known from dealer principals all the way down, even to parts managers.
Right.
The problem is that when you implement 1.5, generally speaking, a parts manager trying to hit 1.5 because he has more than that, he only has a few options to get rid of the parts inventory. So, or at least slim down the parts inventory to 1.5. But before I get talking about that, let me really explain about what that number is and how it's calculated. So 1.5 month supply basically means having 45 days supply of parts inventory on hand. And how we're able to figure out how much that is and what the value should be is we take last month's financial statement, look at the total part sales, minus the gross profit we made, and that amount, once we do that, is called cost of sales. So that's the amount of parts physically that were sold in the parts firm. So here's an example. If we sold, and this is not exact math, but if we sold $600,000 of parts, we had $100,000 of profit. We go 600,000 minus 100,000 gives us 500,000. And that $500,000 is cost of sales. And if we do that by 1.5, that means $750,000 is what our inventory needs to be to hit 1.5. So if a parts manager has $1 million of parts and he needs to get to 750, he has to figure out how to get from 1 million to 750. It's a huge drop.
Right.
So what happens now is a parts manager goes back to his desk and thinks of all the different ways that he can get rid of the parts inventory. The problem is that he's already returning through his OEM, or at least he should be, returning all the parts he needs to or can through his OEM return program. And so what are now his other options? Of course, if you're doing program orders, these large every 6 months doing these program orders, that's the first thing to get cut, right? So that we're not ordering a supply that's 3, 4, 5, 6 months worth in inventory.
Yep.
So that's a no-brainer. That's one of the ways to do it. But realistically, it doesn't actually move the needle any, right, for a parts manager.
Right.
So what actually happens, right? So from upstairs, they're thinking, okay, so we're going to get this number in line. We're going to move from, 1 million to 750, and the parts manager just makes it happen. But what happens is the parts manager is actually sitting in his desk, and he doesn't have a way to make it happen. He's already doing all he can. I'm going to talk about the ways to do it. What happens is the unintended consequences of going or just using 1.5 as the only measurement of parts inventory and not really having a robust plan on how to implement it. What actually happens is many parts managers are backed up against the wall, and what other thing can they do? They order parts, right? They are ordering parts for special order parts for customers. They can't cut that off. They can't really tighten that up, although I'm going to talk about here in a minute. Or they can the other parts that they're ordering is active parts inventory. So guess what they have to cut? What they cut?
Active.
Right?
Yeah.
Parts. So what happens
Obviously.
is that's actually the spin-off. So parts managers will then, depending on their background and their training, some of them will use their gut and just start picking off parts as they look at a stock order, right? Start picking them off, parts that they usually don't stock anymore. Or,
but there's an actual methodology to how you should be doing that, correct?
Well, so there absolutely needs to be and should be a methodology behind how you control inventory. And if you don't have that, and now you have this this mandate to now trim your inventory, you're using your gut, but now you're using your gut even more. So
which probably isn't a very good idea.
Well, not at all, because here's the spin-off effect is when you cut off active inventory, yes, it makes sense that you can cut your day supply. So I see some dealers that are running 45 days supply, 42, 40 days supply. Basically, the rule of thumb is running 30-day supply of active inventory, which makes sense, right? So then how does a dealer have, if he's only ordering on average active parts 30-day supply, but he has 2 months supply and he needs to get to 1.5, why is there such a spread from 30 days, which he wants to stock, to 2 months? It's all the difference. The difference is all the parts he shouldn't have, right? But he doesn't have
Yeah.
a way to
Yeah.
get rid of them. So
Mm-hmm.
what happens now is he's trimming down his active parts. Now it does make sense. The game plan would be to, get down to 30 days supply, right? If you have
Mm-hmm.
more than that, then that is part of the game plan by trimming that, going from whatever you're at
Mm-hmm.
to 30 and keeping at 30. You don't want any less than that
Yeah.
for active parts. But what happens is now they start not ordering active parts inventory that they should have. And they'll come
Right.
up with some, some phasing criteria or user gut or phasing criteria that is either exotic that they just make up to try to choke active inventory from showing up on their stock order and ordering it.
Mm-hmm.
Or what they'll do is use ones that don't have a proven statistic behind it to know what effect it does. I can tell you that nearly overnight, effectively 30 days, by making a couple button presses, you can choke your inventory. And I call it choke because effectively that's what you're doing. You can reduce your inventory 25, 30% like right away. So what happens
Which should make a huge difference when we're talking about large numbers like the 750,000, et cetera, right?
So it makes a big difference whether we're talking about a small dealer inventory that has only $150,000 or we're talking about a very large inventory. But what happens is now when your fill rate or off the shelf level of service, whatever you want to call it, to supply your customers with the parts they need, like, drops dramatically. So I've seen dealers who their off the shelf fill rate is like in the high 40s. And basically they were doing exactly that. They were choking off the active parts because they had a mandate and a ceiling on their inventory. I'm not saying that having a ceiling on your inventory is a problem. That I mean, it makes sense to have it, but it's a measurement, but what's actually inside of that inventory that makes that number. So what happens now is they're trimming up the active parts that don't sell frequently. So they were active, but now they're just not frequent enough. They have to do something, so they cut those first, right? So a part that they sell every single month, they're obviously going to keep that. But one that they sell every
month over month, those parts are going to change, right?
Yeah, well, it changes basic. I mean, it could change day by day, right? Or even transaction by transaction. But realistically, the bulk of the inventory gets reviewed across the board, in its aging analysis and is really monthly. But what happens now is about 25% to a third of a dealer's inventory are those parts that sell bi-monthly to, every third month. But that's a huge portion of the inventory that actually feeds the shop and your customer. It doesn't mean that they're bad parts. And that's a huge population. So what happens when you cut that out, what happens now is you think about the process to bring in a customer into the shop, right? Because for most dealers, the shop is their biggest customer, right? So what happens now is the customer, I mean, for the customer, it's a big process and they hate it just to begin with. I mean, it's just inconvenient. But internally at the dealership, so someone takes their call, somebody looks it up, books them an appointment, the customer comes in, then an advisor handles it. If you have a porter, the porter's moving the car, and then the technician is handling it, driving in and out of the shop. Now they go to parts, they don't have the part, then they're sending the vehicle outside. A
lot of hands in the mix.
There's a lot of hands. It's a lot of time, which means a lot of dollars. But
totally.
But then think about it. So they don't have the part, or they don't have all the parts to complete it. Guess what happens again? Parts department special orders a part, and we do the whole process all over again.
And that's where the problem begins, right?
Well, that's the spin-off of the problem. So what really happens is you get paid by the customer once to finish the job, but you've handled the customer twice, right? That whole process. And the same likewise happens. It's just different when it's wholesale or retail, or they just go elsewhere, right? So these are hidden expenses, costs, opportunities that you can't measure. But what you're measuring is now we're at 1.5 months supply. But I'll tell you that the parts that sell bi-monthly or every third month, right? That's 25% to a third of your inventory value in itself.
That's a lot.
Active parts. It's a lot. So when your parts manager gets his back up against the wall, that's the stuff that's going first, right? Okay. So let me talk about how should you fix it. So the real problem is not for dealers. is not their active inventory, unless you're going crazy with ordering, these program orders and ordering huge supply, and you don't have a handle on day supply. If there's not a strategy behind that, and I mean, you could end up with problems. But generally speaking, that's not the problem. Your problem is not active parts.
Right.
Your real problem is your idle and obsolete parts inventory. So often you'll hear parts managers, define an inventory, whether it's good or bad, by whether or not how much he has of 12 months and older parts. But that is just like.
But they're not actually looking at the parts that are less than 12 months, right? Like what happens to those parts that are 9 months or 10 months or even say sometimes 6 months and see no movement? What happens to those parts?
Well, so those parts, you're exactly right. So what happens is the definition of how much do I have in 12 months and older, right? Is only a small window of what your parts inventory is like. So what happens now is, of course, a parts manager gets rid of the oldest parts in inventory. So whatever oldest parts he has in inventory, at least that are eligible for return, that whole group means that's where he's applying all his return allowance. But then, so the question is, so let's say he has, all his parts are all 12 months older. There's only a couple parts that are 13, 14 months old, but they need to be written off, but aren't. Let's just assume that. So what happens then with the parts which are special order, unsold or returned special order parts now, which are, on day 61? They have to sit there the entire duration until they become the oldest, right? So only defining that your parts inventory is good or bad by looking at the value or the percentage of inventory that's 12 months and older is only a number to look at, right? So what a dealer should actually be looking at for those parts in specific. So it's really about getting a handle on the inventory you shouldn't have. And for some, they can't define this, right? So, or they don't have any visibility into what this means. But really what we need to do to implement properly so we don't create the unintended consequences that you were talking about, really what we need to do is a couple things. And this is a slow process. Like, it doesn't happen overnight. So let me just try to rattle them all off, the things that you need to do without affecting active inventory. So first, I would say it's to make sure that you actually have a proper methodology. We talk about that in various articles we have on our website. Lots. Yeah, we have. Exactly. We have to have a proper methodology that actually, the percentages of the probabilities and the risk associated with ordering a part based off its prior sales history, right? Not just going off your gut and just, I've sold lots of them, but now it's kind of trickled down, but I think I'll sell more, so I'll just order some more in. Exactly. That doesn't work. So a way to know whether a guy has been trained or knows enough to implement a technical criteria is whether or not how he controls inventory can be dialed in and filtered through his entire parts inventory on Excel. If I have my inventory on Excel and I can't filter it to show you what I call active and what I call non-active, like idle and obsolete. If you can't do that on Excel, it means you're winging it. That's what it is, right? Now, maybe you have good experience, but it's years experience don't necessarily always mean that you have the odds working for you, because you don't know what they are. If you knew, then you and things change, right? And new procedures come into play, and when you take that all into consideration, you have to take that back to your parts inventory and implement that properly. Exactly, and through your DMS, right? So so the first step is just knowing that we actually have a strategy or a methodology to handle inventory from the get-go. I mean, that's number one by far, but that's a little more complicated topic for another video. But we do have articles on our website specific on that. So then the next thing, so how do I get to 1.5 months supply then, would be to look at your program orders and just stop ordering them, right? I'm not saying that is the right thing to do, but if you have no other choice, then that is a thing to do, right? Because generally you're ordering these parts because you sell lots of them anyway, but now you're not getting the discount. I know, Sean, some dealers get themselves in the situation where they work for a specific brand, or they're where they are required to order a certain amount of parts, or specific parts, I should say. So what about those dealers? How do they handle it then? Well, you know what? that is a topic in itself. Let me spare that for another conversation. I'll spend an hour on that alone, and how to handle it and what you do. I mean, that gets pretty deep.
Okay.
So here's the thing so you're talking about manufacturer programs. Yeah. You got to think about why those are in place to begin with, and
yeah.
they're in place, yes, to help your inventory, but anyone who's selling you anything, whose interest do they have first? Right?
There.
So that's something to consider, but that's why that becomes a whole conversation in itself. So
it's a recommendation.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the way you need to look at it, is as a recommendation, not as like, the Bible.
This is set in stone. This is what you need.
You never want to do that, right? I'll spare you for another conversation about that. So, then the next thing is making sure that your day's supply, what is your day's supply very specifically, and how do you ensure that that's exactly what you're following, right? So is it 3 days supply? I don't recommend anything less than that for active inventory, because you start running out. That means you're running to other dealers, picking them up. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? But basically, not having part of active inventory is the worst. That's the next thing, getting your day supply to 30, at least on your active inventory. And as for the idle inventory, you're not ordering them unless it's a special order for a customer anyway. So there is no day supply that you set on it, although it's a blanket across your database, or should be. Okay, so then the next thing would be to implement, if you don't already, a special order process where everybody, retail and internal, that's a conversation too in itself, and internal, prepay for their parts, whether it's retail counter.
Which is difficult, isn't it? Because there's a lot of pushback with that.
Yeah, well, there is. And you know where the pushback is? The majority of the pushback is?
It's people ordering it.
Yeah, it's our own people who make the biggest pushback. But we wrote an article on that. You can Google it, top six ways dealers can get a handle on idle and obsolete parts inventory. And we list all these. Yeah. So anyway, prepaid parts, implementing prepaid parts on the retail shop and internal and over the counter is a way to get a handle on it, because the problem, that's where the problem
then
starts.
There's security, right? It's like, the part's coming in, the part's already paid for. So worst case scenario, if it doesn't get picked up, it doesn't get used, it was misordered, whatever, it's still paid for. So you have that security.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you de-risk the probability that the dealership owns the part, right? And that's where the problems come. Like, there is a small, but depending if you're running a proper methodology on your parts inventory and ordering them correctly, there's a small percentage that actually fall off, in a year, that were active and now become idle and obsolete. It's very small. But in comparison, the real problem is, these special order, unsold and returned special order parts. And it's easy to say that, well, we don't have many, but I could tell you that generally speaking, kind of a rule of thumb is the value of parts that you have 10 months and older, you have approximately equal value that are 9 months and less, that are idle. Well, they're not obsolete, but they're idle parts that you shouldn't have. Right. So here, kind of a rule of thumb, if you have 10 months and older parts and you have 100,000, effectively, you can almost bank on that you actually have 200,000 if you were to look at those unsold and returned special order parts, which are not aged out yet. Just because there's no name on them doesn't mean they're not a problem.
Doesn't mean they belong there.
So we special ordered it. We hate special order parts, right? Until they sell them, we love them, obviously. But when we go ahead and the customer cancels or picks it up and returns it, we rip the name off it, doesn't mean they're not a problem anymore. In fact, it's a problem, right? Yeah. So that's the other thing. Implementing prepaid is absolute must. And then the other bit would be trying to get your special order bin in check so that there are no parts in your special order bin older than 30 days old. The next step, because if you let it sit, the longer we wait, the longer the
worse the problem is. It just magnifies it.
Like the probability of the customer coming back, it gets worse by the day. So I mean,
Yeah.
the absolute worst case scenario is not having anything older than 30 days old. 60 days, I mean, is a way to do it, but that's too loose in my opinion. And then,
Yeah.
so then the next strategy would be to implement, would be to have um, pre-booking customers, retail customers, at least for the shop, pre-booking them
Right.
before they leave on that initial visit, before they leave, pre-booking them, this includes warranty too, pre-booking them their next appointment when the part actually lands, right? So that's
Right.
important, so that you're getting a commitment from the customer to actually come back, rather than the part comes in a few days. Now you're working with the customer over the phone, trying to figure out.
Trying to get a hold of them. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You want to do it right off the hop. So this is a very slow, so there's a lot of implementation of process
Yeah.
here.
And it's not just one person either. It takes everybody to participate together, because everybody, as you said, like as that whole process in the beginning that you explained, everybody kind of ties into another, and each position can help implement this, but it takes everybody to work together to implement it as a team, basically, right? To kind of clean this up.
It's a coordinated effort, but the thing is that overnight or even in 30 days, provided you can implement all this stuff, I mean, it'll take some time just to implement this stuff and start checking them off.
Yeah.
It's slow. It's slow to do that.
Yeah.
But if you want an immediate effect, I mean, you already know the answer. How can we have an impact on our inventory overnight to get to our number? And the obvious answer is, well, that's easy. Just stop ordering active parts. But I'll tell you, the cost of that is much bigger than trying to implement proper procedures and a policy to try to get it under control. So here's what I'll leave you with. The real problem is not your active parts inventory. And of course, we all know that, right? The real problem is your idle inventory, and that's what is ballooning. That's what you can only get rid of so much. That's the stuff that creates the problem. And the looser or your processes and policies are on idle parts inventory, like you don't have a prepaid process, you don't have a methodology on inventory control, you don't have, you're not pre-booking customers. I mean, what happens is it starts to get a bit sloppy, right?
Yeah.
Which means that your idle parts inventory, starts to balloon more than, of course, what you can get rid of back to the manufacturer. That just means that when you start to implement 1.5 months supply, the amount of active inventory you have to scale back just to meet that number is even more. So the effect is even worse, right? So,
and especially this time of year, I think dealers are really aware of what that number is. That we're coming to year end. Dealers really know what they're looking at and what has been moving and what is not moving, and that's a big number for some dealers. Some maybe not so much, but I think that this time of year is when, like I said in the beginning, when they're starting to implement and review and just looking at that number and making sure that they're doing, following these steps and starting that implementation now. So, moving forward, then they have a plan in place and they can start building, because if they don't start, then it just keeps compounding, right?
Yeah. And I mean, there's bigger story, what happens is, if it's, month after month, year after year, the parts manager can't get it in check because he really knows that I can only scale back active inventory so much. The problem is what we would see is, we just keep trying to find a silver bullet and replacing parts managers or finding parts managers, or he leaves. He's just like, I can't get this done because he can't get it done. But what we're really missing is, if you got the right guy, you just got to start with training and implement some processes. And yes, some of them are tough, right? Like prepaids are tough, not because it's hard to implement, but it's, you get a lot of pushback internally. And how do we handle? How does the DMS handle it? It's all not hard. It's all, just in your head. But I would say, just going.
Well, we used to, you and I, we've worked together for quite a while. And one thing that we've always been really firm and mutual on is higher attitude. And if they come with the right attitude, you can train them any skill you want, basically. So really making sure with your people in your department that everybody comes with that attitude, that we're going to work at this together and we're going to make this better.
Exactly. I mean, if you got the right guy, got right attitude, right morals and ethics.
Yeah, regardless of if he has 30 years or 10 years experience or, 5 months experience, all those people, if they have the right attitude, then this is fixable, totally.
Exactly. So let me wrap this up with this one last line. What dealers really need to do is 1.5 is not a bad number. Month supply is not a bad number. What happens is how we get to there, how we get to it does matter.
Right.
And if you want to take the easy way out, it just costs you much more dollars. And I mean, you can't even count what the costs are, but it's incredible.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah,
it's not about
absolutely.
taking the easy way out. It's about, okay, so how do we come up with a plan? So I list off a ton of stuff, go to our website, look at the blog section. There's a ton of articles on how to achieve that, and the list goes on. But
absolutely.
I would say that's all I would have to add, at least for this conversation. I could go on for another 3 hours, but we don't.
Yeah, I think that we do this on a regular basis, though.
Exactly. Very good.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for your time.
Thanks.
Okay.